My name is Amanda Walker. I'm 34 years old, and I work as a trauma doctor in Austin, saving people who arrive broken, bleeding, and fighting for their lives. But nothing I've seen in the ER compares to what happened on my 26th birthday. That night, my stepfather broke into my apartment, pinned me to the floor, and dislocated my shoulder with a snap I can still hear in my nightmares. My own mother stood in the doorway, watching calmly, without lifting a finger to stop him. Before I tell you how that night changed everything, drop a comment with the country you're watching from, hit like, and subscribe, because my story might just save someone else's life. Until I was 9 years old, I thought my life was perfect. Not perfect in the way you see in magazines, with big houses or shiny cars, but in the small, warm ways that matter most when you're a child. We lived in a little white house with peeling paint on the shutters, tucked on the edge of a small town in Vermont. The backyard wasn't much, just a patch of grass that led straight into an apple orchard that belonged to our neighbors, but to me it felt like the biggest playground in the world. My father and I spent hours there, riding our bikes between the rows of trees, laughing as the wind tangled my hair and my shoelaces got dusty with fallen leaves. Dad was the center of my life. His name was Thomas, though everyone in town called him Tommy, like he was still the boy who'd grown up there. He had a deep laugh that carried across the yard, and the kind of patience that made you feel like you were the most important person on earth when he listened to you. Every evening after school, I'd drop my backpack by the door and run into his arms, and he'd always lift me high, spinning me around no matter how tired he was from work. He was a mechanic at a small garage, fixing cars for neighbors who trusted him more than the dealerships. Money wasn't plenty, but it never felt scarce because Dad made everything feel enough. Saturdays were our adventure days. Sometimes we'd drive his beat-up Ford pickup into the mountains to hike. Other times we'd fish by the creek, sitting on overturned buckets and talking about nothing and everything. When I close my eyes, I can still hear him saying, "Mandy, remember, it's not about catching the fish. It's about being still enough to notice the world around you." And I'd roll my eyes like kids do, but deep down I loved those words. He was teaching me patience, though I didn't realize it at the time. But my favorite memories were autumn afternoons in the orchard. We'd pick apples until our baskets overflowed, and Dad would always choose one bright red one, rub it on his jeans, and hand it to me first. I'd take a bite, the juice dripping down my chin, and he'd grin like it was the best thing he'd ever seen. Later, at home, Mom would bake pies from the apples we brought, and the whole house would smell like butter. And then, everything changed. I was 8 when the headaches started. At first, Dad brushed them off. He said it was from the long hours at the garage, or maybe because he skipped lunch too often. But soon I noticed how he'd pause mid-sentence, pressing his temples with his fingers, his face tightening. Mom grew worried and begged him to see a doctor. Eventually, he did. That's when the word tumor entered our lives, and suddenly everything I thought was stable turned upside down. Brain cancer. I was too young to fully understand, but old enough to feel the terror in the room when the doctor spoke. I remember sitting in the corner of the hospital office, my legs swinging above the chair, staring at the way Mom's hands shook as she clutched Dad's arm. Dad tried to smile at me, tried to look calm, but his eyes betrayed him. I had never seen fear in them before, and it scared me more than anything. The months that followed felt like living in slow motion. Trips to the hospital became routine. The smell of antiseptic and the beeping of machines filled my senses more than playground laughter or apple pie. Dad lost weight, his skin turning pale, and the sparkle in his eyes dimmed. I clung to every ounce of his energy, every smile he managed to give me. He tried to keep our traditions alive, bike rides, fishing trips, but his body betrayed him. Eventually, our adventures shrank down to sitting on the porch swing together, my head resting on his shoulder while he hummed old country songs. The night he died is still etched in me like a scar. I was 9 and the air was bitter cold. The hospice nurse had told Mom it wouldn't be long. I remember crawling into his bed, tucking myself against him. He whispered, "Mandy, you're my brave girl. You'll take care of Mom now." His voice cracked on those last words. By morning, he was gone. After the funeral, the house felt unbearably empty. I would stand at the back door, staring out at the orchard, waiting to hear his laugh. But all I heard was silence. The pickup truck sat idle in the driveway, a cruel reminder that our Saturday adventures were over. My mom, Caroline, was only 32 then. She had just lost her partner, her best friend, and suddenly she was left with me and a mountain of bills. But if she was afraid, she didn't let it show. She picked herself up and worked with a kind of determination I didn't understand at that age. She got a job at the local supermarket, stocking shelves during the day. In the evenings, after making me dinner, she would change into her cleaning clothes and head out to scrub offices until midnight. Even so, she never let me feel abandoned. She made sure we had small traditions that kept us close. Every Friday, no matter how tired she was, she'd come home with a pizza. We'd sit on the couch, just the two of us, our legs tucked under a shared blanket, and watch whatever movie was on TV. It wasn't much, but to me, it was everything. On Sundays, she'd pull out the old chess set Dad had loved, and we'd play for hours. I wasn't very good, but she'd smile every time I beat her pawns, pretending to be surprised. I realize now how much effort it took for her to give me those moments when she was exhausted and grieving herself. At 9, I didn't see the dark circles under her eyes or the way her hands trembled from scrubbing floors too long. All I saw was my mother showing up for me, keeping the little world Dad had built for us alive, even if it was cracked and fragile. But deep inside, something had shifted in both of us. We were no longer a family of 3. We were a team of 2, clinging to each other against the storm of loss. And even though my mother was strong, even though she worked herself to the bone, I couldn't help but feel the shadow of his absence hovering over every pizza night and chess game. The cancer had stolen my perfect life, and nothing would ever be the same again. When I was 13, everything began to shift. Until then, it had been just me and Mom, surviving on her supermarket paychecks and the extra money she earned scrubbing offices. We were not rich, but there was a certain comfort in our small, predictable life. But then, Eric Hale appeared. It happened in the most ordinary way. Mom had gone to buy groceries after work, and her car wouldn't start in the parking lot. She called the nearest dealership, and that was how she met him, Eric, the owner of Hale Auto. He wasn't like the tired mechanics we were used to. He wore polished shoes, pressed shirts, and had the kind of easy smile that made people drop their guard instantly. Mom said he insisted on giving her a ride home that night because it was snowing, and she was touched by his gentlemanly manners. At first, I wasn't sure what to make of him. He came around with flowers for Mom and little gifts for me, like Marvel comics stacked neatly in glossy plastic covers. I had never been much of a comic book kid, but he talked about the heroes like they were real, his voice animated, his hands moving as if he were reliving boyhood fantasies. Iron Man is just a regular guy with genius and courage, Amanda, he told me once, ruffling my hair. See? Anybody can be a hero if they've got brains and guts. He seemed to know exactly how to win me over. He would park one of his shiny cars in front of our shabby little house and let me sit behind the wheel, explaining all the buttons and dials. I still remember the smell of the leather seats, so different from our old beater that Mom drove to work every day. For a kid who had lost her dad too young, the attention felt intoxicating. I caught myself thinking maybe, just maybe, this man wanted to be a real father to me. Mom glowed in his presence. She started wearing lipstick again, a shade of berry red that I hadn't seen since Dad was alive. For the first time in years, she looked younger, lighter, as though a huge burden had been lifted off her shoulders. I was happy for her. I really was. After all she had been through, she deserved someone who treated her with kindness, someone who could give her more than endless exhaustion. A year later, Eric proposed. He did it in grand style, at a restaurant we had only ever walked past before because it was too expensive. I remember the chandelier lights sparkling above us, the clink of wine glasses all around, and then Eric dropping to one knee with a velvet box. Mom's hands flew to her mouth, and tears welled up in her eyes as she said yes. The entire room clapped, and I sat there, half proud, half overwhelmed, thinking, our lives are about to change forever. And change they did. Within weeks of the wedding, we packed up our little Vermont house, the peeling shutters, the orchard down the road, the memories of Dad, and moved into Eric's world in Connecticut. His house wasn't just big, it was enormous, like something I had only seen on TV. There was a long driveway lined with trimmed hedges, a pool that sparkled even in the winter light, and more bedrooms than I could count. My room had pale yellow walls, its own bathroom, and a walk-in closet I didn't even know how to fill. At first, it felt like a dream. Mom marveled at the kitchen with double ovens and granite countertops, running her hand across them as if they were made of gold. She said she'd never scrub offices again, and for the first time, she seemed to breathe easily. Eric beamed, showing us around like a magician revealing his tricks. "This is your new life," he told us. "No more struggling, no more scraping by." And in those early days, I believed him. That summer, he threw me a birthday party by the pool, complete with balloons, a cake bigger than anything I'd ever had, and even a few kids from school I barely knew but who showed up for the spectacle. Eric flipped burgers at the grill, splashing water on us like he was everyone's fun uncle. He looked at me and said, "See, Amanda? I told you I'd give you the kind of life you deserve." At night, when I lay in my big new bed, I would think about Dad and feel a sharp pang of guilt, like I was betraying him by liking this man. But I was just a teenager, and the comfort of new clothes, comic books, and a pool in the backyard made it easy to bury that guilt. Mom kept saying, "He's good for us, Amanda. He'll take care of us." The neighbors all seemed impressed with Eric, too. He had that charisma that drew people in, always shaking hands, remembering names, making jokes at just the right time. People treated him like a pillar of the community, the successful dealership owner who had everything. Inside our home, things felt steady, almost too steady, like the calm surface of a lake hiding whatever swirled beneath. I was only 14 when I first noticed the cracks, but in those first months, I didn't see them. At 13, I thought we had been saved. I thought the lonely, hard years after Dad's death were finally over. Looking back now, I can see how carefully Eric constructed that image of himself. The gifts, the grand promises, it was all part of a performance, and we were his audience. But at the time, I was just a girl desperate for someone to fill the hole my father's death had left. I thought Eric Hale might be the answer. I couldn't have been more wrong. A year after the wedding, the first warning signs began to show themselves. They felt like little inconveniences, harmless rules, or practical decisions Eric framed as being in our best interest. It started with money. One evening after dinner, Eric sat us down at the kitchen table. He had spread out bank statements, envelopes, and a yellow legal pad in front of him, like he was conducting some kind of board meeting. He spoke in that calm, confident tone of his, the one that made it sound like he had everything figured out. "Caroline," he said to my mother, "this system of separate accounts is messy. You're paying bills from your checking. I'm covering the mortgage from mine. Amanda's school supplies are being charged to your card. It's chaotic. Families should operate as one. We need a single account in my name so everything is organized. That way, I'll handle the finances and you won't have to stress about a thing." Mom hesitated. I remember how her hands twisted in her lap, her wedding ring catching the light. She had always been proud of managing what little money she and I had before. But Eric smiled and added, "It's not about control, it's about security. Isn't that what you want?" Within a week, all of Mom's accounts were closed. Her paychecks, small as they were, got redirected into the joint account that wasn't joint at all. It was his. He gave her a credit card for household expenses, but she had to ask him before buying anything more than groceries. At 14, I didn't grasp the full weight of what had just happened. All I knew was that suddenly Mom would think twice before buying me new shoes or even a notebook because we have to check with Eric first. The next step was her friends. Before Eric, Mom had a small circle of women she leaned on, neighbors, coworkers, a woman named Linda she had known since high school. They would sometimes come over for coffee, or Mom would meet them for a walk in the park. After the move, she tried to keep those friendships alive, but Eric found ways to make her stop. He'd make little comments when one of them called. "Again? Don't they have husbands or families of their own to bother?" If she wanted to meet a friend for lunch, he'd sigh and say, "You're really going to leave me here with Amanda after I've worked all week?" That doesn't seem fair. Other times, he'd say her friends weren't on her level anymore, as if living in his big house made her too good for the people she had leaned on during the hardest years of her life. Eventually, the invitations stopped coming. Linda left a message one day, her voice tight, saying, "I don't know if I did something wrong, Caroline, but I miss you." Mom never called back. I asked her why, and she just shook her head and said, "It's easier this way." And little by little, her smile started to fade. It wasn't immediate. In the beginning, she seemed happy in the big house, relieved that the bills were paid and she didn't have to drag herself to 2 jobs. But as time went on, I noticed her laughter grew quieter, less frequent. When Eric was in the room, she seemed to shrink into herself, as if waiting for his approval before speaking. Her wardrobe changed too. My mother had never been flashy, but she liked nice clothes. She loved floral skirts in the summer, fitted sweaters in the winter, and always a touch of color on her lips. She kept a small box of lipsticks in the bathroom, shades that reminded me of different times in her life: deep berry from her younger days, soft pink she wore on weekends, bright red for special occasions. One day, I noticed the box was gone. Her closet began filling with plain blouses, long skirts, muted colors that Eric said looked more appropriate for a married woman. When I asked her about her lipstick, she gave me a tired smile and said, "Eric doesn't like it. He says I don't need to draw that kind of attention." It broke my heart in a way I couldn't quite name back then. I missed the sparkle in her eyes when she got dressed up just to take me for pizza on Fridays. Now, even our pizza nights were different. Eric would join us, and the old jokes and chess games disappeared. At school, I threw myself into homework and friends, but the change at home was impossible to ignore. The house that had once felt exciting now felt heavy, filled with unspoken rules. I learned quickly to read the tension in the air, the way Mom would stiffen when Eric's car pulled into the driveway, the way her voice grew soft when she answered his questions. And yet, to the outside world, nothing looked wrong. If neighbors came by, Eric greeted them with charm, offering them drinks by the pool. Mom smiled politely, as though everything was fine. But when the guests left, she retreated into silence, sitting at the edge of the bed while Eric scrolled through his phone, oblivious. Later, I was 15 the first time I saw his rage without the charming mask. It was a Saturday, the kind of ordinary day that should have vanished into memory, laundry tumbling in the dryer, the TV murmuring some home improvement show. Mom came home from the outlet mall with a paper bag and a soft smile I hadn't seen in months. She had found a sweater on clearance, nothing flashy, oatmeal-colored, a crew neck. She ran her fingers over it like it was a small piece of happiness she was finally allowed to keep. Eric noticed the receipt before he saw the sweater. His jaw tightened, a vein at his temple jumping like a warning light. "You didn't ask," he said, voice quiet in the way thunder is quiet before it hits. Mom tried to explain that it was $30, that she'd used the card for household, that winter was coming and her old sweaters were thin at the elbows. He lifted the receipt with 2 fingers like it was contaminated and said, "You don't spend money without my say, so." "That's not how families work." Mom reached toward his wrist. "Eric, it's just a..." The plate left his hand so fast my brain lagged behind the motion. It shattered against the wall beside the pantry, a bright comet of ceramic and sauce. Scarlet streaks slid down the paint like blood, dripping onto the baseboard, pooling in delicate arcs on the tile. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The TV kept cheerfully advising how to choose backsplash grout while our kitchen turned silent and feral. Then came the next motion, not a punch, not yet, but a shove. He pressed at Mom's shoulder as she stooped to gather shards, hard enough that she stumbled against the cabinet. "Look what you made me do," he muttered, eyes on the wall as though she had thrown the plate. I smelled the warm tang of tomatoes and something acidic underneath, fear turning metallic in my mouth. Mom whispered, "I'm sorry," and started blotting the red with paper towels that shredded as she dabbed, leaving lint stuck like confetti to the stain. After that, sorry became a currency in our house. It bought pauses, not peace. The pushing and shoving arrived like unwelcome relatives who never left, a palm to Mom's back when she moved too slow, a forearm to herd her out of his way, fingers closing around her upper arm long enough to leave yellow marks that ripened into green. He never used a closed fist then. It was as if he was measuring, calibrating, testing how far the boundary would bend before it broke. And he learned it would bend a lot. I learned quickly, too. I learned the pitch of his footsteps on the hardwood after 2 beers versus 3. I learned to chop onions quietly, to set the table so the forks lined up like little soldiers, to never leave a receipt on the counter. I learned the safest spot in the kitchen was the far side of the island, and the safest answer was always, "You're right." At night, lying awake, I would trace the faint line of dried sauce Eric hadn't seen in the grout and feel the panic creep up my throat like steam. School became oxygen. I joined everything I could plausibly join: yearbook, debate, science club, even a volunteer recycling program that met in a drafty gym once a week. I told teachers I loved staying late to help label supplies, to reformat spreadsheets, to stack chairs. I discovered that fluorescent lights at 6 p.m. felt like sanctuary if it meant I could avoid the 6:30 clink of Eric's glass on our counter. My backpack got heavier with any book I could pretend to need. I did homework in the library until the custodian flicked the lights, apologetic but firm. "Closing time, kiddo." I'd smile like I wasn't afraid of the dark waiting for me at home. Friends' houses became second homes. I perfected the art of casual. "Can I hang for a bit?" Group project. "Do you mind if I crash until my mom gets me?" Their mothers offered me bowls of pasta, asked polite questions, didn't push when my answers were too neat. I stayed until the latest moment that wouldn't tip into suspicion, then texted Mom from the driveway. "Here." She'd answer with a single heart or a thumbs up she must have hoped he'd never see. Sometimes, when I did walk into the kitchen at the wrong time, I caught the awful choreography in motion, his hand around her wrist, not squeezing, just holding, the way a handler holds a leash. "We talked about this," he'd say. "You make me feel disrespected." The words were polished, professional, like he'd practiced them in a mirror. Mom would nod, eyes down, and murmur the script. "I know. I'll do better." I started running laps during gym even when we weren't required to, a private training for flight. The cold air burned my lungs and gave me a reason for the redness in my face that wasn't crying. In the locker room mirror, I studied my expression the way surgeons study scans. Was anything showing? Could anyone see the fracture line where a normal life had split? When I had to be home, I shrank my presence the way Mom shrank hers. I moved quietly, closed doors gently, learned to glide out of rooms the second his attention shifted. He praised my maturity at dinner in front of guests, told people he was proud of how disciplined I was. I pressed my napkin into my lap so hard the threads left a grit on my palm. Mom stopped buying anything that looked new. The sweater disappeared into the back of her closet like a punished child. She wore the same gray cardigan, so often the cuffs went shiny. If she reached for lipstick, she caught herself and pulled her hand away as though the tube might burn. Once, passing her in the hallway, I blurted, "You look pretty, Mom," because I needed her to believe it. She flinched, then smiled, then glanced over my shoulder to make sure no one had heard. Even after the wall was repainted, I could still see the outline of the stain whenever the afternoon light came slanting in. That was the day the world tilted, and nothing in it sat level again. Eventually, I left for Chicago on a scholarship, clutching a duffel. The train pulled in before dawn, and the city rose up in glass and steel like a dare. I dragged my bag past platform pigeons, past a coffee stand where the barista called everyone Han, and for the first time in years I felt air that didn't taste like walking on eggshells. The dorm lobby buzzed with rolling suitcases and nervous parents. Mine didn't come. I told the RA I was fine. It was half true. Freedom and grief can live in the same body like mismatched roommates who learn to ignore each other. My scholarship covered tuition and a basic meal plan. Everything else I earned swiping ID cards at the library and shelving reserves in the basement where the fluorescent lights hummed like bees. My roommate, Danny from Iowa, kept a cactus named Anthony on the window ledge and wrote organic chemistry notes in color-coded pens. She taught me how to make boxed mac and cheese without burning it, and I taught her how to fold fitted sheets because my mother, even in her shrinking world, had insisted on neat corners. At night, the L rattled past like a heartbeat, and I lay awake tasting possibility. I chose psychology. I wanted a language for what we'd survived. Intro to Psych cracked something open: attachment, conditioning, learned helplessness, words that steadied me the way a railing steadies weak knees. In Abnormal Psych, we traced patterns of control until I could have drawn Eric's silhouette with my eyes closed. In Research Methods, I learned to count realities other people tried to deny. I joined a lab that studied trauma and resilience, coding interviews from women whose stories felt like letters from a future I wanted to write for myself. I made friends the way people do when they're starved for normal, over bad coffee and better jokes. Layla from Detroit, who collected thrifted coats like talismans and swore by the museum's free days. June, a quiet genius in stats, who taught me to love the way numbers could hold pain gently without looking away. We walked to the lake in October wind that cut through our thrift store scarves. The water looked like hammered pewter. I felt small and safe under a sky too big for secrets. Michael showed up at a volunteer fair, handing out flyers for a community center on the south side. He had the softest kind of kindness. No performance, no savior glow, just steady eyes and a laugh that felt like a porch light. He was studying social work, already practicing listening like a craft. Our first date was greasy spoon pancakes at 11 p.m., the kind that come with a lake of syrup and a waitress who calls you baby. We talked until the place flipped chairs onto tables. He walked me to the dorm in air that smelled like cold metal and rain, and when he hugged me goodbye, I didn't brace. With Michael, everything was modest and real: bus transfers, 2-for-1 burritos, Sunday laundry folded on my bed while we traded Spotify headphones. He carried a pocket spiral notebook where he scribbled resources for clients he didn't yet have: food pantries, legal clinics, shelters, like a boy building a bridge out of phone numbers. He believed people could heal if someone kept showing up. And I wanted to believe that too. I started therapy at the campus counseling center after I froze during a role-play exercise in a trauma class. The therapist, Dr. Reyes, had gray curls and a voice that never hurried. The first session, I apologized for crying. She said, "Tears are data." We tracked mine like weather. I told her about the plate hitting the wall, the lipstick that went into a drawer and never came out, the way my mother's shoulders had learned a permanent flinch. Dr. Reyes didn't gasp or search my face for permission to believe me. She believed first. It felt like stepping onto ground that held. Homework shifted from chapters to choices, naming what had happened without softeners, replacing "he got mad" with "he shoved her," practicing saying no out loud in a small office with a box of tissues that never judged me. I called my mother twice a week. Our conversations lived on the surface. "How are classes?" she'd ask, voice bright like artificial light. "Busy," I'd say, describing professors, midterms, the price of textbooks. If I asked how things were at home, she'd say "normal" too quickly, then steer toward recipes or the weather. Sometimes I heard the way fear thins a voice, turns it into thread. Sometimes I heard his footsteps. Once she whispered, "I'm fine," and the second syllable quivered as if the word had a fever. I mailed her photos of the campus in spring: pink trees, students sprawled on the quad pretending the future wouldn't grade them. "You should visit," I wrote on the back of one. She called the next night. "Oh, honey, Chicago is so far." "Eric," she stopped. "He doesn't like cities," she finished, as though that explained anything at all. In therapy, Dr. Reyes and I made safety plans for a woman who wasn't in the room. I collected hotline numbers, shelter addresses, legal aid clinics, printed them in small font, and laminated them like they could be stronger that way. I tucked copies into a novel I sent home, inside the dust jacket where only a reader would find them. Weeks later, the book arrived back in a box of winter clothes I had forgotten in Vermont, the papers missing. No note. I took a part-time shift at the crisis hotline, my hands trembling the first time I said, "I'm here with you." On Friday nights, my friends and I played cards at a chipped dining table, laughing like people who didn't know fear a tithe. On Sundays, Michael and I cooked a pot of chili big enough to feed anyone who stopped by. Chicago taught me a new scale. Crowded trains, street festivals, libraries humming at finals. I learned to be two people at once, the student who aced research design, the daughter who memorized the tone her mother used when someone else was in the room. Sometimes guilt washed through me, that I had left, that I was laughing, that my days were measured in pages read instead of footsteps counted. And still, every call ended the same way. I love you, Mom. And I love you too, darling. The darling would thin out at the end, a note going flat, and I'd sit on the edge of my narrow dorm bed with my phone in my lap, staring at the ceiling tiles as if they held the next line. Classes pressed forward, papers due, exams scheduled by people who didn't know they were rescuing me. I noticed something strange during a Sunday video call, the kind you take while folding laundry and pretending everything is fine. Mom angled the phone too low, and for a second the camera caught the edge of her cheekbone, a smear of yellow-brown under a powdery veil. The bruise had that healing halo color I knew from first aid manuals. She adjusted the phone quickly, smile turned up too high. Bad lighting, she said, as if shadows could leave fingerprints. Behind her, the kitchen window showed the pool in Connecticut, the water flat and cold blue. I told her I missed her. She said the word sweetheart like walking on glass. After we hung up, I sat on the dorm floor with my laptop and a knot in my throat, the radiator clicking like a metronome for a song I didn't want. In therapy, Dr. Reyes had told me to name things plainly. So I wrote, bruise on face, denial. Then I typed domestic violence shelters near Westport and opened tabs until my screen looked like a quilt of exits. Hotlines, legal aid, safe housing. I printed a list, slid it under my pillow like a talisman, then texted Michael, need to talk. He called back before the typing dots even blinked. We made a plan the way you plan for a storm you can't stop, small things layered. I asked Mom to set a code word, chess, something we used to say on Fridays when Dad and I battled over pizza. If she texted chess, I would call 911 for her. She said she didn't need a code word, then lowered her voice to a whisper that wasn't like her at all. Everything's normal. The word clattered to the floor between us. In the background, I heard keys, a door, the slow, careful way she breathed when she wasn't alone. The next week, I mailed her a thin envelope addressed to her work, not the house. Inside, I tucked a brochure from a shelter 2 towns over, a safety plan printed in small font, and a prepaid flip phone I'd activated under a random name. I left nothing obvious, no righteous declarations to inflame him, only lifelines disguised as ordinary paper. But Eric found it anyway. That night, a number I didn't recognize flashed on my screen. When I answered, the line exploded with his voice too loud, too close, like he was talking with his mouth at the speaker. You think you're helping, he barked. You're ruining our family. I could hear the TV in someone else's living room and a dog barking, and realized with a drop in my stomach he was in a neighbor's house. He liked to borrow authority from other people's rooms. Somewhere behind him my mother cried out, a small startled sound. Then a crack like ice splitting. That your phone, he jeered. She won't need it. The line went dead. I sat there with the dial tone buzzing in my head, palms pressed so hard to my knees I left crescents. Michael put his arms around me, and I didn't flinch. The relief of that made me cry harder. We called the hotline first. The advocate sounded like warm hands. She told me I had done the right things, that I could request a welfare check if I believed Mom was in immediate danger. I called the local police in Connecticut. The dispatcher's voice was neutral, procedural. They said they would send a unit. If she declines assistance, the dispatcher warned, our options are limited. For 2 days, Mom's number rang into a void. I tried the landline. Eric answered and hung up without a word. I emailed her from 3 accounts with subject lines that wouldn't raise suspicion. I asked the neighbor, whose phone he'd used, to tell her I loved her. The neighbor wrote back. They said everything's fine, that brittle suburban script. I slept with my phone on my chest, screen brightness low, notifications on for unknown numbers. I packed a small bag without admitting that's what I was doing. Copy of my lease, passport, spare keys, the list of shelters folded into my wallet till it felt like a second spine. Michael sat with me at the kitchen table, our mugs leaving pale rings. "You can't save her alone," he said quietly, not as a limit, but as a promise to stay. I added another sheet to the stack: orders of protection, how to document injuries, how to store evidence somewhere he wouldn't find it. On the third night, the neighbor's number lit up my screen again. I answered on the first ring. He didn't shout this time. He spoke in a voice so calm it made my skin crawl. "You like to play Dr. Amanda? Here's your diagnosis, meddler." In the background, I heard a sob and the dull thud of something hitting drywall. "You want to teach her about boundaries? I'll teach you a lesson instead." The line clicked off, and the quiet that followed felt like a door swinging shut at the end of a long hallway, no handle on my side. At midnight on my 26th birthday, I had fallen asleep on the couch with a heating pad on my neck and an unfinished paper on trauma theory open on my laptop. The lock on my front door gave a warning I felt in my teeth, a slow creak, then a heavy thud. A second. A third. The chain snapped like a wishbone and the door burst inward. Eric filled the doorway in his leather jacket, his breath sweet with whiskey, his eyes fixed on me the way a driver fixes on a deer just before the collision. I didn't even stand up before he was on me. He grabbed a fistful of my hair and yanked me forward so hard the world pixelated. The first punch was a flashbang bright, then black. I tried to crawl toward the bedroom where my phone charged, but he caught my wrist and twisted. I felt the joint argue with itself up my forearm, and then he wrenched my arm behind my back until something deep in my shoulder unzipped with a wet, electric pop. The noise came out of me before the pain did, a small animal sound I didn't recognize as mine. He hauled me by the hair and hissed in my ear, promising to teach me a lesson, his favorite textbook since I was a teenager. I kicked blindly and connected with the coffee table, candles toppled, wax slithered. I remember thinking, absurdly, that my new rug would never come clean. I saw movement behind him. In the doorway he had split open like a rib, my mother. Her coat was buttoned to the throat despite the heat in the apartment, purse strap still on her shoulder as if she were a guest who might leave any second. The hallway light cut her face in two, one side shadowed, the other a calm mask. "Mom, help." I heard my voice ricochet off the walls, a sharp, torn thing. She stood there, not screaming, not running, not dialing 911. Her hands were folded like she was waiting in line at a pharmacy. I will spend years trying to read that face, fear turned to frost, loyalty wired to the wrong outlet, but in that moment it was only this, my mother, watching me suffer. He slammed me into the bookshelf, picture frames hopping like startled fish. I crumpled onto my left side, the dislocated shoulder already swelling, heat pouring off it like a stove burner. My vision narrowed to a tunnel with one bright object at the end, the phone on the bedroom floor, its charging cable a white snake. I belly crawled. He kicked me in the ribs, something cracked. The room went swimmy, the edges gray. Out of an old reflex, my body looked for air the way a dying plant looks for sun. I got my good hand around the phone. My thumb fumbled at the screen. I remembered what the therapist had said about safety planning, what Michael had taped to the inside of my kitchen cabinet. Program SOS, know it with your eyes closed. With God's help and muscle memory, I pressed the side button in that frantic pattern. A siren shrieked from the tiny speaker, louder than his voice, louder than the humiliation in my chest. The countdown flashed red. Emergency. 911. He jerked, startled by the alarm, then ripped the phone from my hand and hurled it into the closet where it vanished under winter boots. I lay there gulping thin air, tasting dust, the floor cold through my cheek. He crouched and slapped me, quick and practiced. "You think anyone's coming," he said. Somewhere behind him, a neighbor's door opened. I heard a woman's voice down the hall, "What on earth?" And a man say, "Call it in." Eric stood, paced, came back and towed my knee like I was an uncooperative package. He kept talking, words a sludge I couldn't focus into meaning. The siren on my phone kept screaming from the closet. I don't know how many minutes passed, pain has its own calendar. He dragged me toward the door, hair scraping the floor, shoulder lighting every neuron I owned. In the hallway, my mother stepped back like a pedestrian giving space to an ambulance. "Caroline," I said, because saying mom felt like begging, and my ribs ached when I begged. Her eyes flicked to my face, to his hands, to the open door across the hall where Mrs. Patel clutched her robe and whispered into a phone. Eric noticed her and straightened, suddenly polite, smoothing his jacket like a man adjusting for a portrait. "Family matter," he told the neighbors. Then, to meet Lo, "You brought this on yourself." Footsteps thundered on the stairs, the building's cheap carpet turning each stride into a dull drumbeat. "Chicago police." The words broke him open. He pushed me back into the apartment and slammed the door, but the jam had already cracked. It rebounded. Two officers flooded the room with uniforms and training. Their voices were steady, the way a good river is steady no matter what falls into it. Commands I had heard 1,000 times on TV and never believed would sound like a lullaby. "Sir, hands where we can see them. Step back. Step back." Eric spun between fight and flight, then lunged toward the kitchen as if knives could make him immortal. The taller officer snapped a taser cartridge onto his unit with the efficiency of someone who'd done it in the rain. "Don't," he said, and didn't need to say more. I heard my mother say, very softly, "Eric," as if they were at a dinner party and he was reaching for the wrong glass. The officers moved. The moment folded. Eric went down hard on my rug with a noise that lived somewhere between a curse and a sob. Plastic zip ties whispered. Someone turned off the SOS siren in the closet. Silence fell like snow. An officer knelt beside me. "Ma'am, can you hear me? What's your name?" I told him. The words slurred. "Happy birthday," I almost said, but I bit it back because I didn't want it tied to this night forever in anyone's memory but mine. A paramedic touched my shoulder and I arched without meaning to, a starfish pinned wrong side up. "Anterior dislocation," she said to her partner, then to me, "We've got you." My ribs complained when I breathed, a shallow, sticky ache that made the ceiling swim. They slid a collar around my neck in case my stubborn spine had suffered more than pride. Someone asked for my pain from 0 to 10. I gave them a number I hoped would earn mercy. They lifted me with a scoop stretcher, and I saw the room from a new altitude. The couch where I had slept curled around my laptop, the birthday cupcake box still closed on the counter, the door sagging like a tired jaw. My mother stood in the doorway, and for a moment the hallway light softened her. I thought I saw her reach for me, but it was only the way shadows move when sirens paint the walls red and blue. I closed my eyes and let them will me away. The ambulance was its own small place. The doors slammed and the streets unspooled behind us, city lights turning to streaks. The paramedic with the calm voice placed in 4, their fingers firm and practiced. "You're doing great, Amanda." I wanted to tell them I wasn't great, that I was the opposite of great, that I had failed to save myself for too long, and now here we were, a patient and a witness riding through a city that did not know my name. The fentanyl found my blood and softened the edges of the night. At the hospital, fluorescent light washed everything the same unflattering shade. They cut my shirt. X-rays showed what my body already knew, a shoulder sulking out of its socket, ribs fractured like dry twigs, a concussion pulsing behind my eyes like a metronome. They set the shoulder, traction, rotation, a thunk that made me hiss, and taped my chest for comfort I would only really feel days later. A nurse tucked a warmed blanket around me with the tenderness people usually reserve for newborns. In the next bay a child cried. Somewhere a monitor chirped in a steady, indifferent rhythm. The ER had always felt to me like a train station. Everyone passing through, nobody staying, the air thick with stories you couldn't carry home. A detective came, asked careful questions, left a card with a square of hope in the corner, a case number. The officer stopped by to tell me he was in custody and that a neighbor's video had captured enough. My mother did not come back. I stared at the ceiling tiles arranged like chess squares and pretended to move pieces. The morphine made the room wobble, and in the wobble I saw Vermont orchards and Chicago winters and the face I wanted my mother to have shown me in the doorway and did not. A resident rechecked my pupils. A tech wheeled me to CT. In the quiet between steps, the pain crowded in with its whole family. Just before dawn, they dimmed the lights at my bedside. A volunteer pressed a cup of ice chips into my hand and called me honey. I sucked one, then another, and watched the color return to the world molecule by molecule. My throat burned where I'd swallowed screams. In the glass of the cabinet, I caught my own reflection, one eye blooming purple, dried blood like rust on my cheek, hair snarled into a crown I hadn't earned. I reached with my good hand and touched the place where the shoulder had been coaxed back home. It held. Outside, somewhere, sirens sounded for somebody else. Inside, I listened to my own breath and realized it was still there, small and stubborn, but mine. The night had taken plenty, but not that. The case moved too slowly, but it moved. There were hearings, continuances, filings that sounded like math problems. I learned the language of orders and affidavits, of chain of custody and victim impact. I told the truth under oath with my arm in a sling and purple still fading along my jaw. When the verdict came, I didn't feel triumph, just a long exhale I'd been holding since childhood. Eric was sentenced to 17 years in prison. The judge read the number in a steady voice, and it settled over the room like winter. I watched the bailiff lead him away, orange swallowing the man who had tried to swallow me. He looked back once. But for the first time, I didn't. My mother testified. Her hands trembled as she swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and then she did, in the halting way a person speaks when language is finally allowed to stretch its legs. She said years of fear had left her paralyzed, that obedience had grown around her like ivy, soft at first, then strangling. I wish I moved sooner, she told the prosecutor, voice barely above a whisper. I wish I moved at all. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear paper sigh. I wanted to touch her hand. I didn't, because we were both constructing new spines in real time and some things you have to do without leaning. The body keeps score. Mine needed rehabilitation. The shoulder learned to stay home again, the ribs to knit. Physical therapy became a second job, bands that looked harmless but burned, tiny motions that rebuilt a map from bone to brain. A concussion clinic taught my eyes to track without stuttering, my balance to trust the floor. I learned recovery is boring in the way building a life is boring, and that boredom is a kind of luxury after violence. Between appointments, I slept like a cat, in patches of sun, grateful for every ordinary hour. The mind needed its own long walk back. I stayed in therapy. Weeks layered into months, into years. I learned to name what happened without apology, to let rage be a color that could exist without painting every wall. EMDR sessions untied knots I thought were permanent. Sometimes I left Dr. Reyes's office shaky and proud the way you feel after finishing a hard run. Out of that slow work, Safe Horizon was born. It started as a file folder on my desk labeled Dream, then became a Craigslist lease and secondhand furniture, and a bell on the door that chimed each time someone new crossed the threshold. New York gave us a small, bright storefront and an endless line of people who deserved better. We built a center for victims of violence with the pieces we could gather, legal clinics on Tuesdays, counseling groups every night but Sunday, a pantry with diapers and rice. We sat with women while they filled out protective orders. We found beds when the city was out of beds. We created a closet stocked with interview clothes, phone chargers, a wall of sticky notes covered in bus routes. I thought I would stop there, live in that work forever. But hospitals called to me the way rivers call to people who long for clarity. I did a post-botch, studied in the sliver hours, took the MCT with my hands shaking and still passed. Medical school was a tunnel with a bright spot at the end. Residency was a storm where I discovered I could stand. In trauma, everything I'd lived coalesced into the one thing I could offer, calm in chaos. The first time I reduced a stranger's dislocated shoulder, a flash of carpet and winter boots flickered at the edges of my vision. I breathed and kept going. Now, in Austin, I work the night shift, stitches neat as cursive, hands steady. Sometimes a patient asks if it hurts me to do this work. I tell them truthfully, it hurts in the right way. Safe Horizon runs without me most days, directed by a team of women who have turned it into a network louder than any one voice. I fly back for board meetings and fundraisers, sit in the front row like a proud aunt, and cry right on schedule when a survivor cuts the ribbon on a new playroom. My mother lives alone now, in a small apartment with bookcases she built herself and a kitchen she keeps stocked with tea. She found a job at the library, shelving stories and recommending novels with the soft authority of someone who has survived the worst chapter and kept reading. We talk about ordinary things, the officious cat who supervises the reference desk, the teenage volunteers she bribes with cookies, the woman who cried at the circulation counter because someone finally said, "I believe you." And one day she sent me a photo. It was just her in the hallway mirror, wearing a simple black dress and bright red lipstick, the shade that had gathered dust in a drawer for decades. The caption said, "Felt like me today." I sat in my car outside the hospital and stared at her mouth, at the small rebellion painted there, and I cried into my hands. Not because all was forgiven or fixed. Because agency had returned to its rightful owner. 17 years is a number that will someday end. I know that. What we built because of it does not have an expiration date. My mother stamps due dates into novels and whispers book club gossip. I walk past swinging trauma doors and whisper encouragement into bleeding rooms. Safe Horizons bell keeps chiming, one life, then another, then another. And at the very end of each call with my mom, she says confidently, "I'm wearing it today." I picture her at the desk, a flash of red when she smiles, and I think, we made it out far enough to recognize ourselves again. It took me decades to understand something. I thought I was protecting my mother by staying silent, by carrying the weight of her choices. I thought enduring my stepfather's cruelty would eventually make me stronger. But I was wrong. We deserve to live, not just endure. To choose our clothes, our lipstick, our friends. To say no without fear. To look at ourselves in the mirror and see someone whole, not broken, not ashamed, not defined by anyone else's control. Safe Horizon, my center in New York, is not just a building with walls and a door. It's a promise that no one has to go through what I went through alone. When I sit across from women with bruises hidden under sleeves, or children who flinch at sudden noises, I tell them the truth. Healing is really possible. So if you are listening to my story right now, remember this. You do not have to accept cruelty just because it comes from family. You are not obligated to destroy yourself in order to keep someone else comfortable. Have you ever been forced to choose between family loyalty and your own freedom? And what would you have done in my place? Write your own story in the comments below. I will read everyone. But before you go, please subscribe to my channel and hit the like button. It might help someone you know escape from the same darkness I once lived in.